When you think of Henry VIII children, you probably picture the ruthless Bloody Mary or the glorious Elizabeth I. But there was another child, one whose brief reign would reveal a darkness that even his notorious father might have found disturbing. Edward VI, the boy king who inherited the throne at 9 years old, would transform from a seemingly innocent child into one of England's most authoritarian rulers before meeting an end so twisted that it would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a sick boy dying young. It's about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, even in the hands of a child. What you'll discover about Edward's final days will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Tudor legacy. The making of a monster. The year was 1537, and Henry VIII finally had what he desperately craved, a legitimate male heir. Edward's birth was celebrated across England as the answer to decades of dynastic uncertainty. But his arrival came at a terrible cost. His mother, Jane Seymour, died just 12 days after giving birth, leaving the infant prince motherless and making him even more precious to his increasingly paranoid father. From his earliest days, Edward was treated not as a child, but as England's future salvation. He was surrounded by guards, tutors, and courtiers who reminded him constantly of his divine destiny. This isolation from normal childhood experiences would prove to be the first step in creating a monster. Unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had both experienced their father's wrath and rejection, Edward knew only praise and adoration. Henry VIII, perhaps feeling guilty about his treatment of his daughters, showered his son with attention and affection that bordered on worship. The young prince was given the finest tutors money could buy, but these weren't ordinary teachers. They were radical Protestant theologians, chosen specifically to mold Edward into the perfect Protestant king. From the age of 6, Edward was studying not just Latin and Greek, but detailed theological treatises about the evils of Catholicism and the divine right of Protestant monarchs to rule absolutely. The education that Henry VIII arranged for his son was more like indoctrination than learning. Edward's primary tutor, John Cheek, was a brilliant scholar, but also a religious extremist who filled the boy's head with visions of England as a new Jerusalem, purified of Catholic corruption. Every lesson, whether in history, philosophy, or statecraft, was filtered through this lens of Protestant supremacy and royal absolutism. By the time Edward was 8 years old, he could recite complex theological arguments for why Catholics deserved death and why any opposition to his future rule would be tantamount to opposing God himself. What made Edward's upbringing particularly dangerous was how it combined intellectual sophistication with complete emotional isolation. While he could debate theology with university professors, he had never played with other children or experienced normal human relationships. His only companions were adults who treated him with reverence, creating a boy who understood complex political theory but had no grasp of human empathy or the value of individual life. This toxic combination of supreme intelligence and emotional stunting would define every aspect of his future reign. The boy king's cruelty. In the autumn of 1547, England found itself ruled by a 9-year-old boy who had been raised to believe he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Edward VI ascended to the throne following his father Henry VIII's death, inheriting not just a crown, but a kingdom torn apart by religious upheaval. The young king had been molded by the most radical Protestant tutors his father could find, men who filled his head with visions of religious purity and absolute authority. Unlike his older sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had experienced their father's wrath firsthand, Edward had been sheltered, praised, and told from birth that he was destined for greatness. This combination of divine authority and childish petulance would prove deadly for thousands of his subjects. The England that Edward inherited was a powder keg of religious tension. His father had broken with Rome and established the Church of England, but the country remained deeply divided between Catholics, moderate Protestants, and radical reformers. Edward's Regency Council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, initially seemed to promise moderate governance. However, the young king had his own ideas about how England should be ruled. From his very first council meetings, Edward demonstrated an unsettling combination of childish petulance and cold calculation. interrupting experienced advisors to lecture them about Protestant doctrine. What struck contemporary observers was how quickly the 9-year-old king began asserting his authority. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward was personally reviewing death sentences and showing disturbing enthusiasm for executions of those he deemed heretical. Court records from this period reveal a child who treated matters of life and death like intellectual exercises, debating the theological justifications for various punishments with the same detachment he might discuss Latin grammar. Witnesses reported that Edward would often smile when signing death warrants, apparently pleased with his own cleverness in finding scriptural justification for each execution. The boy king's early months were marked by what courtiers privately called religious tantrums, explosive fits of rage whenever anyone suggested moderation in religious policy. Edward had absorbed his tutor's lessons so completely that he genuinely believed any compromise with Catholic practices was a personal betrayal of Christ. When an advisor suggested allowing some Catholic nobles to continue private worship, Edward reportedly threw his inkwell at the man and screamed that God would punish England for such weakness. These incidents were initially dismissed as childish behavior, but they actually revealed the forming of a genuinely dangerous religious fanatic. Perhaps most disturbing was Edward's apparent lack of normal childish interests. While other 9-year-olds played with toys, Edward spent his free time reading accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and taking detailed notes on interrogation techniques. His personal servants reported finding drawings in his chamber depicting various torture methods, annotated with Edward's commentary on their effectiveness for extracting confessions from heretics. The boy who should have been learning to ride horses was instead studying the most efficient ways to break human bodies and spirits in service of his Protestant vision. A reign of terror. What made Edward particularly dangerous was his combination of religious fanaticism and royal authority. While his advisors plotted and schemed around him, the boy king absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with terrifying enthusiasm. He kept detailed journals of his reign, and these documents reveal a child who delighted in descriptions of executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of those he deemed heretics. By age 10, Edward was personally composing sermons that were delivered in churches across England. Sermons that call for the complete elimination of Catholic influence and promised divine punishment for anyone who showed mercy to heretics. The young king's cruelty wasn't limited to religious matters. Edward demonstrated a vindictive streak that shocked even hardened courtiers who had served his ruthless father. When servants displeased him, Edward would devise elaborate punishments that seemed designed more to humiliate than to correct behavior. One unfortunate page who spilled wine on Edward's papers was forced to stand in the courtyard for hours while courtiers threw rotten food at him, all at the specific direction of the 11-year-old king. Edward watched these humiliations with obvious pleasure, often taking notes on the victims' reactions as if conducting scientific experiments. The boy king's journal entries from this period reveal a mind that was becoming increasingly detached from normal human emotion. Edward wrote about the sufferings of others with the same clinical detachment he used to describe the weather, noting details of pain and fear as interesting observations rather than tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on Edward's orders for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers, the young king's only recorded comment was to note that the correction proved more effective than anticipated in removing the subject from further error. Edward's treatment of his own family provided perhaps the clearest indication of his growing sociopathy. Despite being raised alongside his sisters during early childhood, Edward showed no natural affection for Mary or Elizabeth once he assumed the throne. Instead, he viewed them through the same religious lens he applied to all his subjects. Mary was a dangerous Catholic who needed to be controlled or eliminated, while Elizabeth was a potential ally whose Protestant sympathies made her marginally more acceptable. Family relationships for Edward were purely political calculations. The transformation became even more apparent when Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, attempted to gain influence over him through gifts and flattery. Rather than being swayed by kindness, Edward saw Thomas's overtures as attempts to manipulate him and responded with cold calculation. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, Edward not only supported his execution, but reportedly watched from his window, as the man who had once been kind to him was dragged to the scaffold. Witnesses reported that the boy king showed no emotion as the axe fell, instead making notes in his journal about the effectiveness of different execution methods. The tyrant intensifies. As Edward entered his 12th year, his authoritarian tendencies intensified dramatically. The boy who had once seemed frail and bookish began asserting direct control over government policy, often overruling his advisors when he felt they were being too lenient. His Protestant reforms became increasingly draconian, with mandatory church attendance enforced by networks of informants and severe penalties for any deviation from approved doctrine. Edward personally designed a system of religious surveillance that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud, with neighbors encouraged to spy on neighbors and children rewarded for reporting their parents' religious transgressions. The king's obsession with control extended to every aspect of English religious life. Edward issued detailed regulations governing not just public worship but private devotions, dictating exactly how his subjects should pray, what they should believe, and even how they should think about God. Violation of these regulations was treated as treason against both crown and deity, with punishments that escalated from public humiliation to imprisonment to death. The boy king personally reviewed every case, often increasing the recommended punishments because he felt the original sentences showed insufficient zeal for Protestant purity. Edward established what were essentially thought police, encouraging subjects to report on their neighbors' religious practices with rewards for successful denunciations. The young king took personal pleasure in reading these reports, often summoning the accusers to court to provide additional details about their neighbors' supposed transgressions. Those found guilty of Catholic sympathies faced imprisonment, torture, or death, with the young king personally reviewing and often increasing the recommended punishments. Edward's court became a place where paranoia and fanaticism were rewarded, and mercy was seen as weakness. The machinery of persecution that Edward created was remarkable for its systematic nature and the king's personal involvement in its operation. Unlike adult rulers who might delegate such matters to subordinates, Edward insisted on reviewing every case personally, studying the details of each accused person's alleged crimes, and often devising specific punishments tailored to what he saw as their particular theological errors. His journals from this period read like manuals for religious persecution, filled with detailed discussions of which punishments were most effective for different types of heresy. What made Edward's persecution particularly chilling was how he combined childish creativity with deadly serious intent. When traditional punishment seemed insufficient, the teenage king would invent new forms of humiliation and suffering, always justified by elaborate theological arguments. One Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith was forced to carry a sign reading "Enemy of Christ" through the streets of London while children threw stones at him, all at Edward's specific direction. The king watched this spectacle from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's suffering while dictating observations to his secretary. Family as political pawns. The king's obsession with religious purity extended to his own family in ways that revealed his complete lack of natural affection. Edward viewed his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, not as family, but as the greatest threat to his Protestant England. In private letters that survived, Edward wrote about Mary with a hatred that was both childish and chilling, referring to her as the bastard and Christ's enemy, while plotting ways to have her declared illegitimate or even executed for heresy. The boy who should have felt brotherly affection instead harbored fantasies of seeing his sister burn at the stake for her religious beliefs. Edward's hatred of Mary went beyond mere political calculation. It seemed to consume him with a personal intensity that worried even his most radical advisors. The young king spent hours devising scenarios where he could legally eliminate Mary from the succession, consulting with Protestant lawyers who were all too willing to find legal justifications for what amounted to fratricide. Court observers noted that Edward's mood would darken whenever Mary's name was mentioned, and he would often retreat to his chambers to write long screeds about the theological necessity of removing her from the line of succession. The boy king's plans for dealing with Mary became increasingly elaborate and cruel. Edward drafted detailed scenarios for Mary's arrest, trial, and execution, complete with specific charges of heresy and treason. He even wrote what he intended to be Mary's confession, forcing her to renounce Catholicism and acknowledge her illegitimate birth before being granted the mercy of a quick death by beheading rather than burning. These documents, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a mind that had moved far beyond normal political rivalry into genuine sociopathic hatred. Edward's treatment of Elizabeth was more complex, but equally disturbing. While he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he viewed his younger sister primarily as a useful tool for his religious agenda rather than as family. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's eventual marriage as a way to cement Protestant alliances, treating her future happiness as irrelevant compared to the political advantages her marriage might bring to his cause. Even his relatively positive feelings toward Elizabeth were filtered through his religious obsessions, making it clear that his sister's value to him was purely instrumental. The king's inability to form normal family relationships extended to his broader court as well. Edward treated his nobles, advisors, and servants not as individuals with their own worth, but as pieces on a chessboard to be moved according to his religious and political strategies. Those who served him faithfully for years could find themselves discarded or even executed if they showed insufficient enthusiasm for his increasingly extreme policies. Loyalty to Edward meant complete submission to his vision of Protestant England, with no room for personal conscience or moral qualms. A plot born of madness. When Edward began showing signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior became even more erratic and cruel. Rather than softening in the face of mortality, the 15-year-old king became obsessed with ensuring that his Protestant reforms would survive his death. He knew that Mary's accession would mean the restoration of Catholicism, and this knowledge drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The possibility of his life's work being undone by his Catholic sister filled Edward with a rage that bordered on madness, leading him to contemplate solutions that would have horrified even his tyrannical father. The young king's declining health seemed to intensify rather than moderate his extremism. As Edward grew weaker physically, his religious fervor burned even brighter, as if he were trying to compress a lifetime of Protestant purification into his remaining months. Court physicians reported that the king's illness was accompanied by periods of fevered preaching, during which he would deliver rambling sermons about the need to eliminate Catholic influence, even if it meant killing every Catholic in England. These rants were initially dismissed as delirium, but Edward's lucid moments revealed that his extreme statements reflected genuine intentions rather than sickness-induced ravings. Edward began secretly meeting with Protestant extremists, plotting a coup that would bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. The conspiracy that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty, involving plans to arrest or kill both of his sisters and install a puppet regime controlled by Protestant fanatics. The 15-year-old king, despite his physical weakness, threw himself into these planning sessions with an energy that amazed and frightened his co-conspirators. The details of Edward's final plot revealed the full extent of his transformation from innocent child to would-be tyrant. Working with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, Edward crafted a plan that would have resulted in the deaths of both his sisters and the installation of a Protestant regime more extreme than anything England had ever seen. The conspiracy included provisions for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the seizure of all Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in planning these atrocities was both detailed and enthusiastic. The dying king spent his final weeks drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be seized, and laws to be enacted in his Protestant paradise. His handwriting, increasingly shaky due to his illness, filled page after page with plans for what amounted to religious genocide. The boy who had once seemed like an innocent victim of political manipulation revealed himself to be the driving force behind a conspiracy that would have made the Spanish Inquisition look merciful by comparison. A grotesque end. But Edward's illness had a cruel twist that seemed almost like divine retribution for his planned atrocities. Modern medical analysis suggests that the young king suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and what was likely arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his own physicians in a misguided attempt to treat his condition. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly poisoned by the very people trying to save his life. As the poison slowly destroyed his body, Edward experienced hallucinations and periods of madness that were interpreted by his courtiers as religious visions. The boy who had shown no mercy to others spent his final weeks in agony, his body racked with pain as he slowly wasted away. Court physicians noted that Edward's suffering seemed to intensify his religious fervor rather than providing any spiritual comfort, as if his physical torment was feeding his mental obsessions rather than purifying them. The manner of Edward's death was particularly horrifying for those who witnessed it. Court physicians recorded that the young king's body began to emit a foul odor weeks before his death, and his skin took on a greenish tint that suggested severe poisoning. Edward's hair and fingernails began falling out, and he suffered from violent convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed. The boy who had once been considered one of the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children became a grotesque shadow of his former self, his body seemingly rebelling against the poison that was killing him. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the king remained lucid enough to understand what was happening to him, spending his final days alternating between screams of physical agony and fevered rants about Protestant martyrs. Edward's last coherent conversations were not about reconciliation or forgiveness, but about his regret that he wouldn't live to complete his planned purification of England. The dying king begged his conspirators to proceed with their plot even without him, promising them that God would reward their faithfulness in establishing his Protestant paradise. The young king's final hours were a grotesque parody of a deathbed scene. Instead of seeking forgiveness or expressing love for his family, Edward spent his last breath cursing his Catholic sister and praying for God to preserve Protestant England from what he called Mary's wickedness. Witnesses reported that his final words were not of peace, but of hatred, a fitting end to a life that had been consumed by religious fanaticism and political extremism. The aftermath and legacy. When Edward finally died on July 6, 1553, the relief among his courtiers was palpable, though few dared express it openly. The boy king who had promised to be England's salvation had instead become its nightmare, and his death offered the only escape from increasingly extreme policies that were driving the kingdom toward civil war. Even his most devoted supporters privately acknowledged that Edward's death might have been a mercy for England, though they would never have admitted such thoughts publicly. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed how completely his carefully laid plans had been built on the foundation of his personal authority. Without the king's driving will behind the conspiracy, it collapsed within days as moderate Protestants abandoned what they now recognized as an extremist plot. Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary of Edward's coup, found herself virtually friendless as nobles who had seemed committed to the Protestant cause suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. Mary's successful claim to the throne was supported not just by Catholics, but by moderate Protestants who were horrified by what Edward's reign had revealed about the potential for religious extremism. The boy king who had dreamed of becoming England's greatest Protestant champion had instead ensured that his reign would be remembered primarily for its cruelty and the relief that followed his death. Even committed Protestants found themselves welcoming Catholic Mary as a preferable alternative to the continued rule of Protestant extremists. The irony of Edward's story extends far beyond his failed succession plans. The young king, who had been so obsessed with eliminating Catholic influence, actually strengthened it through his extremism. His persecution of moderate voices within the Protestant movement had left English Protestantism dominated by fanatics who repelled ordinary believers rather than attracting them. By the time of his death, many English Protestants were beginning to view Catholicism as a refuge from the increasingly harsh demands of Edward's version of Reformed religion. Modern historians have begun to reevaluate Edward VI's reign, and the picture that emerges is far darker than the traditional narrative of a sickly boy manipulated by ambitious advisors. Court records and private correspondence reveal a young man who was genuinely enthusiastic about persecution and showed disturbing signs of enjoying others' suffering. Edward's personal involvement in planning executions and his detailed journals documenting torture methods suggest that England was ruled for 6 years by what can only be described as a child psychopath with unlimited power. The transformation of Edward from innocent child to cruel tyrant offers disturbing insights into the corrupting nature of absolute power. Unlike adult rulers, who might at least retain some capacity for empathy or political calculation, Edward's complete isolation from normal human relationships and his total belief in his own divine authority created a perfect storm of cruelty. The boy who had never been told no, and who believed that opposition to his will was literally sinful, became capable of atrocities that shocked even the violent Tudor age. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward's courtiers were increasingly frightened by their young king's behavior, but felt powerless to restrain him. The same divine right doctrine that justified his rule also made any opposition to his will tantamount to blasphemy, leaving even his closest advisors unable to moderate his increasingly extreme policies. The boy king had created a system where his slightest whim became law, and his growing taste for cruelty had no check except death itself. Perhaps most chilling of all is the question of what might have happened if Edward had lived to reach full adulthood. His plans for Protestant England included the establishment of a permanent religious police force, the complete elimination of Catholic nobility, and the creation of a surveillance state that would have monitored every aspect of his subjects' private lives. The teenager who died in 1553 had already begun implementing these policies on a small scale, and there is every reason to believe that a mature Edward VI would have created one of history's most oppressive regimes. The legacy of Edward VI serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that good intentions can be corrupted by unlimited power and religious fanaticism. The boy king who believed he was saving England's soul nearly destroyed its body, and his death may have been the greatest mercy his reign could have offered his subjects. His story stands as a warning about the dangers of combining absolute authority with ideological certainty, especially in the hands of someone too young to understand the full consequences of their actions. Edward's story also illuminates the dangerous intersection of youth, power, and ideology. While adult tyrants might be restrained by political calculation or personal relationships, Edward's complete isolation and absolute belief in his own righteousness made him capable of contemplating atrocities that even hardened political operators found shocking. The child who should have been playing with toys was instead planning mass executions and religious purges, treating human lives as expendable resources in his quest for religious purity. The boy king's reign also demonstrates how education can become indoctrination when it lacks balance and human perspective. Edward's tutors had created a brilliant theological scholar, but a moral monster, someone who could construct elaborate intellectual justifications for cruelty, but who had never learned basic human empathy. His story serves as a warning about the dangers of any educational system that prioritizes ideological purity over human decency. In the end, Edward VI's brief reign stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of power corrupting innocence. The boy who began as Henry VIII's cherished heir ended as a figure so frightening that his own death was celebrated by his subjects. His transformation from protected child to would-be tyrant reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the particular dangers posed by those who believe their cruelty serves a higher purpose. The death of Edward VI marked not just the end of a life, but the end of what might have been England's darkest possible future. The boy king's final agony, racked with pain and consumed with hatred for his own family, serves as a fitting conclusion to a reign that had promised so much hope but delivered only fear. In dying young, Edward VI may have inadvertently performed his greatest service to the England he claimed to love, sparing it from the full flowering of his terrible vision.